The word Nephilim appears only a few times in the Hebrew Bible. The most cited instance is in Genesis 6:4, placed in a short passage before the flood narrative. Many English translations render the verse with the same key term and a similar shape of wording, even when they differ on details. One common line reads, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days." The text gives no full description of what they looked like, how long they lived, or how they governed daily life. It preserves a name, an ordering of characters, and a setting that is simply called the earth. In later centuries, readers treated that brief wording as incomplete rather than final. Ancient interpreters wrote alongside it, not inside it. Their work survives in multiple languages and in fragments tied to specific places. The Septuagint, a Greek translation associated with Jewish communities in the Hellenistic period, renders the Hebrew term with gigantes, a word that could carry meanings beyond physical size. The Latin tradition later used gigantes as well, which shaped how medieval readers pictured the passage. Those translation choices did not add new events, but they did add a stable image that could travel across regions where Hebrew was not read. A second biblical reference appears in Numbers 13-33, within the report of scouts describing the land of Canaan. The line is presented as speech, filtered through fear and comparison. In many Bibles it reads, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." The verse links the Nephilim to the Anakim in the same sentence, then moves on. The story is not set in a global age ruled by a different order of beings. It is set in a specific journey tradition, attached to a land claim and a memory of first entry. The Nephilim function there as a name used to measure human weakness in a moment of uncertainty. Outside the Bible, the richest early expansion comes from Jewish writings of the Second Temple period. The best known is 1 Enoch, a collection of texts that took shape over time rather than being written in one sitting. Portions of it were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, first reported after discoveries near Qumran in 1947. The Enoch material includes descriptions of watchers, unions, and offspring that are larger than humans, with a resulting breakdown of order. The book does not read like a field record, and it does not identify itself as history in the modern sense. It does, however, show what certain groups thought Genesis 6 could mean when read as a doorway rather than a closed statement. Modern scholars track those developments with careful attention to language and manuscript history. Annette Yoshiko-Reed has written on how Enochic literature shaped Jewish and Christian ideas about angels and origins in the centuries around the turn of the era. Lauren T. Stuckenbrook has examined how giants, traditions circulated and changed between Aramaic fragments and later translations. Their work stays close to the evidence that exists, surviving copies, the dating of layers, and the way specific terms move between languages. In that frame, Nephilim becomes a label whose meaning shifts with each community that repeats it, rather than a single fixed biological category. Some early Christian writers treated the Nephilim passage as a problem to manage. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, argued against the idea that angels could produce children with women, preferring an explanation tied to human lineages. His approach did not erase the older reading, but it shows how interpretation could be shaped by what a thinker considered possible. Other writers, including those who kept Enochic material in circulation, treated the Watcher reading as useful for explaining violence and disorder in primordial time. None of those positions rely on measurements, bones, or named rulers. They rely on how a few lines of scripture can be placed into a wider account of origins. When people today describe the earth when the Nephilim ruled, they usually merge several different sources into one smooth picture. That picture often includes giant bodies, structured dominance, and a daily life that ordinary humans could not endure. The underlying texts do not offer that full sequence. Genesis gives a sentence and moves forward. Numbers preserves a frightened comparison, spoken by scouts. Enoch expands the story in a way that reads like moral narrative, rather than documentary report. Later commentaries argue with each other about what the expansion should even be allowed to say. The idea of rule, in the sense of administration or government, belongs mostly to later synthesis. Archaeology enters the discussion because the ancient Near East did preserve records of kings, cities, and disasters, and those records are often more detailed than biblical narrative. Royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia, such as those from Assyria and Babylonia, list campaigns, building projects, and tribute. They do not list Nephilim. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in various versions, includes a hero described with extraordinary attributes and a story that includes a flood motif. It offers an example of how ancient literature could frame beings larger than ordinary humans, without claiming to be a census. Scholars point out parallels and differences with care, usually without treating any one text as a hidden code for another. Claims about giant skeletons have circulated for more than a century, often tied to newspaper stories from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These reports are frequently difficult to verify, and many lack museum catalogue numbers, excavation logs, or remains that can be re-examined. Institutions such as the Smithsonian have repeatedly stated that they do not have evidence of a suppressed record of giant human bones, and professional archaeological publication standards require provenance, measurements, and access for review. That does not stop the stories from repeating, because repetition does not require surviving specimens. It only requires a name, a place name, and a statement that sounds final. In the academic study of the Bible, the Nephilim references are usually treated as traces of older traditions that were not fully preserved. That approach is cautious and limited on purpose. It allows a reader to say that a culture remembered something about mighty ones or unusual figures without pretending to reconstruct an entire world from 2 verses. Michael S. Heiser, who wrote for popular audiences while grounding his work in Semitic languages, often emphasized that the passage is short and that later interpretations fill most of the space. The restraint in that kind of work is not an attempt to drain interest from the topic. It is a way of keeping words from growing larger than the sources that carry them. A factual account of Earth, when the Nephilim ruled, therefore, begins with a smaller claim. The ancient texts that mention the Nephilim do not describe an environment in which human survival is measured in hours. They preserve a name connected to a time described as violent and disrupted, and they sit beside later writings that expand the story into a broader mythic history. The modern phrase is a later container built around older fragments. The fragments remain real, readable, and tied to dates, manuscripts, and places. The larger picture is a product of how people, across centuries, have tried to make a brief line feel like a full landscape, where the word first appears in ink. The earliest surviving appearances of the word, commonly translated as Nephilim, are preserved in Hebrew manuscripts, whose physical forms date much later than the traditions they contain. The Masoretic text, standardized between roughly the 7th and 10th centuries CE by Jewish scribes in Tiberias and Babylon, is the primary source behind most modern Hebrew Bibles. In that tradition, the word appears as Nephilim, written with a consonantal root and vowel markings added long after the consonants themselves were fixed. The scribes did not explain the term. They preserved it as received, alongside many other rare words that appear only once or twice in the entire corpus. Before the Masoretic standardization, biblical texts circulated in less uniform forms. Scrolls discovered in the Judean desert, particularly those associated with the Qumran community near the Dead Sea, include portions of Genesis and Numbers that predate the Masoretic manuscripts by nearly 1,000 years. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of Genesis confirm the presence of the Nephilim passage without expanding it. The wording aligns closely with later Hebrew versions, suggesting that the line itself was already stable by the Second Temple period. What is absent from these fragments is as important as what remains. There are no marginal notes explaining who the Nephilim were, no added descriptions of size, and no inserted narratives about their daily actions. The physical context of these manuscripts matters. They were written on parchment and papyrus, copied by hand, and stored in jars or caves under dry conditions. Radiocarbon dating and paleographic analysis place many of the Qumran biblical fragments between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. That timeframe situates the Nephilim references firmly within a tradition already considered ancient by the people who preserved it. By then, the word functioned as a recognized term whose meaning was assumed to be known or, at least, not in need of clarification within the text itself. Parallel to the Hebrew tradition, Greek translations played a major role in fixing how later readers encountered the term. The Septuagint, usually dated between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, was produced for Jewish communities in the Eastern Mediterranean who no longer used Hebrew as a daily language. In Genesis 6-4, the translators chose the word gigantes. In classical Greek literature, That word referred to a mythological group associated with rebellion against the gods, but it could also carry a more general sense of beings, marked by excess or violence. The Septuagint does not pause to justify the translation. It simply substitutes a familiar Greek term for a rare Hebrew one. That choice had long consequences. When early Christian writers quoted the Old Testament, they often relied on the Greek version rather than the Hebrew. As a result, gigantes entered theological discussions that were already shaped by Greek mythic vocabulary. By the time Latin translations were produced, including those associated with Jerome in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the term had already travelled far from its original linguistic environment. Jerome, who consulted Hebrew sources for his Latin Vulgate, still rendered the word as gigantes, aligning with established usage rather than introducing a new Latin equivalent. The Numbers 13 to 33 passage followed a similar path. In Hebrew, the verse records the words of the Israelite scouts as reported speech. The Nephilim are mentioned as part of a comparison meant to convey fear. In Greek and Latin, the same comparison remains, with the translators again opting for gigantes. The rhetorical function of the verse stays intact across languages. It is not a report of direct observation confirmed by others. It is a quotation embedded within a narrative about hesitation and perception. Outside the biblical canon, other texts from the same general period show how readers filled in what the scripture left sparse. The Book of the Watchers, part of the larger one Enoch collection, survives in Ethiopic manuscripts dating to the medieval period, with older Aramaic fragments found at Qumran. These writings use different terms alongside ideas clearly connected to Genesis 6. They describe offspring who consume resources, cause disorder, and provoke divine response. The manuscripts themselves vary, indicating that the tradition was fluid rather than fixed. Copyists transmitted the story, but they also inherited variations already present in their exemplars. The presence of multiple textual streams complicates any attempt to speak of a single, unified ancient account. Hebrew biblical manuscripts, Greek translations, Aramaic expansions, and later Ethiopic copies all preserve overlapping but non-identical material. Scholars reconstruct these relationships through comparison, noting where wording aligns and where it diverges. The Nephilim references in the Bible remain notably restrained when set beside the more elaborate Enochic descriptions. That restraint suggests that the biblical authors or editors chose not to elaborate, even if other traditions were circulating at the time. Early rabbinic literature reflects this same tension. Some rabbinic texts briefly comment on Genesis 6, offering etymological suggestions or moral observations, while others pass over the verse without discussion. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE, does not dwell on the Nephilim. Later Midrashic collections sometimes interpret the term through wordplay, connecting it to roots meaning to fall, or to cause others to fall. These explanations focus on behavior rather than physical form. They do not present the Nephilim as rulers of an age in a political sense. They frame them as figures associated with decline. By the early Christian period, debates about the passage often centered on what kind of beings could exist, rather than on reconstructing a historical environment. Writers such as Justin Martyr and Tertullian accepted angelic interpretations, while others rejected them. Augustine's objections, written in North Africa in the early 5th century, influenced Western theology for centuries. His arguments were philosophical and theological, not archaeological. They show how the Nephilim passage became a testing ground for broader assumptions about the nature of angels, bodies, and reproduction. Throughout this long transmission history, one feature remains consistent. The manuscripts preserve the name, but not a detailed description of a world structured around it. The Earth of Genesis 6 is introduced in general terms, populated by humans, marked by increasing violence, and followed quickly by the flood narrative. The text does not pause to describe architecture, climate conditions, or systems of control attributed to the Nephilim. Those absences are not gaps left by damage or loss, they are features of how the passage was written and preserved. When modern readers encounter the idea of a distinct era dominated by the Nephilim, they are engaging with a layered tradition built over centuries. The earliest inked appearances give only a trace. Later copies maintain that trace with careful consistency, Expansions occur outside the biblical text, in parallel writings that reflect specific communities and concerns. The physical manuscripts, dated, catalogued, and studied, anchor the discussion in material evidence. They show where the word appears, how it is rendered, and what is not said alongside it. The time placed between two floods. Ancient texts often organize the past through sequences of generations rather than through numbered years. In the Hebrew Bible, the period in which the Nephilim are mentioned is located by genealogy, not by calendar. Genesis chapters 5 through 9 form a continuous structure that moves from Adam to Noah, with brief interruptions for observations about the condition of the earth. The reference to the Nephilim appears within that structure, positioned before the flood narrative, but after a long listing of lifespans. The placement is deliberate. It situates the name within a time already marked as distant and difficult to measure. The genealogies themselves are repetitive and formulaic. Each entry lists a name, an age at which a son is born, additional years lived, and a total lifespan. These figures extend far beyond later historical norms, with some individuals said to live more than 900 years. The text does not explain why lifespans are so long in this sequence, nor does it connect them directly to the Nephilim. The long lives form part of the background against which Genesis 6 is read, contributing to a sense of an early world ordered differently from later eras. Chronology becomes more complex when the flood is introduced. The Genesis flood narrative includes specific time markers, such as the age of Noah at the onset of the flood and the number of days the waters prevail. These markers create a contrast with the earlier, less anchored descriptions. The Nephilim reference sits just before this shift. It belongs to the pre-flood world, but it is not embedded within a dated event. It is a statement of presence rather than a record of action. Other ancient Near Eastern traditions also place disruptive figures in periods defined by catastrophe. Mesopotamian king lists, preserved in several copies from the early 2nd millennium BCE, divide history into eras before and after a flood. In these lists, early kings are said to reign for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns become shorter and more recognizable. The lists do not mention Nephilim, but they reflect a shared habit of structuring time around a dividing disaster. Scholars note that such lists function less as historical registers and more as cultural memory devices. The Sumerian king list is especially clear on this point. It opens with the statement that kingship descended from heaven, followed by a series of rulers whose reigns stretch into implausible lengths. Then comes the flood, described briefly, after which kingship resumes with more modest durations. The text does not describe daily life under the early kings, nor does it explain how ordinary people survived those eras. The emphasis remains on order, interruption, and restoration. This structural similarity to Genesis has been observed since the 19th century, though modern scholarship avoids treating one text as a source for the other without clear evidence. In the biblical account, the flood serves as a boundary rather than a solution explained in detail. Genesis 6 describes an increase in violence and corruption, but it does not catalogue specific practices. The Nephilim are mentioned in the same section, but without a causal link spelled out in the text. The narrative moves quickly from observation to decision to action. The time before the flood is treated as a single moral and narrative space, not as a sequence of documented stages. Later Jewish and Christian chronographers attempted to assign numbers to these early periods. The Book of Jubilees, likely composed in the 2nd century BCE, rewrites Genesis using a calendar based on jubilees and weeks of years. In Jubilees, events are carefully dated relative to creation. The Nephilim-related material is absorbed into this framework, but the text still does not pause to describe their environment. It locates them in time without expanding their world. Early Christian writers continued this effort. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century CE, compiled a chronicle that aligned biblical history with Greek and Roman timelines. His work survives in fragments and translations, but its method is clear. He sought to synchronize genealogies, reigns, and events into a unified timeline. The Nephilim passage posed a challenge because it lacked internal dates. Eusebius acknowledged it by placement rather than explanation, treating it as part of the antediluvian era without further comment. In Islamic tradition, which also preserves accounts of early prophets and floods, the period before Noah is similarly distant and sparsely detailed. The Quran does not mention the Nephilim by name, but later Islamic historians such as al-Tabari included narratives of early beings and extended lifespans in their universal histories. These accounts often draw from Jewish and Christian sources alongside local traditions. As with earlier texts, the emphasis lies on sequence and lineage rather than on reconstructing living conditions. The idea of a world bounded by floods appears in cultures far beyond the Near East. In Mesoamerican traditions, such as those preserved in the Popol Vuh, earlier creations are destroyed by water before the current human age begins. In Greek mythology, the flood of Deucalion marks the end of a Bronze Age and the start of renewal. These stories vary in detail and purpose, but they share a pattern of dividing time into eras separated by overwhelming events. None of them offer practical descriptions of how life functioned in the Lost Age. The Lost Age is defined by its end. When modern writers speak of Earth when the Nephilim ruled, they often compress this pattern into a single image. Ancient sources, however, distribute meaning differently. They mark the early world as long, loosely defined, and ultimately unsustainable, without specifying its mechanics. The Nephilim name appears within that broad zone. It does not anchor a reign, a dynasty, or a dated episode. It signals that the period carried traditions of beings remembered as different from later humanity. Chronological studies today rely on textual criticism rather than on attempts to harmonize myths into a single timeline. Scholars compare genealogies, calculate symbolic numbers, and analyze how ancient cultures used exaggerated lifespans to convey distance from the present. The numbers themselves are often understood as schematic. They establish order rather than precision. Within that framework, the Nephilim passage remains a brief marker, not a chronological hinge. Geology and archaeology operate on entirely different timescales, measured in strata and material remains. Flood narratives are sometimes compared with evidence for regional flooding events, such as those identified in Mesopotamian river systems around the 4th millennium BCE. These correlations are cautious and limited. They do not extend to identifying a global flood or to mapping textual figures onto excavated layers. The Nephilim references remain outside the scope of material dating, because they are not tied to artifacts or sites. What the placement between creation and flood achieves, textually, is a sense of compression. Vast lifespans, unnamed populations, and brief observations are folded into a short narrative span. The Nephilim exist within that compression. They are part of the remembered texture of the antediluvian world, but not its measured structure. The ancient authors and editors allowed the name to stand without elaboration, trusting the larger framework to carry meaning. The result is a time period that is clearly defined by boundaries and almost undefined within them. It begins after the first genealogies and ends with the flood. It contains a reference to the Nephilim without contextual detail. It is preserved consistently across manuscripts and translations. That consistency suggests that the lack of detail is not accidental. It reflects how the earliest texts chose to represent a world they placed beyond ordinary historical reach, how size, violence, and memory became linked. Ancient languages often connect ideas through proximity, rather than through explicit explanation. In the Hebrew Bible, the brief mention of the Nephilim appears alongside statements about increasing violence on the earth. Genesis 6-11 notes that the earth was filled with violence, using a term that elsewhere describes social breakdown rather than isolated acts. The text does not say that the Nephilim caused this condition. It places the name in the same narrative space. Over time, that closeness allowed later readers to treat size, power, and violence as related features of the same remembered period. The Hebrew word translated as violence, kwamas, carries a range of meanings. It can refer to physical harm, but also to injustice and the misuse of strength. In prophetic literature written centuries later, the same term describes corrupt courts and exploitation of the weak. When Genesis applies it to the pre-flood earth, it does so without examples. The reader is not given scenes or incidents. The condition is stated, not illustrated. That restraint shapes how memory works, because later, traditions must supply images if they want them. The association between great size and threat appears in many ancient cultures, often without literal intent. In Ugaritic texts from the Late Bronze Age, Enemies of the gods are described with exaggerated physical traits that signal danger rather than anatomy. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero is said to be 2/3 divine and of extraordinary stature. His size is part of what makes his actions disruptive as well as impressive. The text does not describe him ruling the world through systems or laws. His presence changes the balance of his city simply by existing within it. Greek literature uses similar patterns. The Gigantomachy, a mythic battle between gods and giants, portrays the giants as embodiments of excess and rebellion. Their size is emphasized, but it functions as a visual shorthand for disorder. When the Septuagint translators chose gigantes for Nephilim, they drew on this existing semantic field. The choice imported a cluster of associations that Greek readers already understood, even if those associations were not present in the Hebrew term itself. In Hebrew, the root often connected to Nephilim is NPL, meaning to fall. Some later interpreters suggested that the name implied fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. This reading appears in later Jewish commentaries and midrashic texts. It does not describe height or weight. It describes effect. The Nephilim are defined by what happens around them, rather than by measurable features. That focus on impact rather than form aligns with how ancient texts often encode memory. Violence, in these contexts, is rarely treated as a list of acts. It is a condition of imbalance. In Genesis, the phrase, filled with violence, suggests saturation rather than event. The earth itself is described as affected. This language mirrors other ancient descriptions where land suffers because of human behavior. In Mesopotamian flood stories, noise and disruption rise to a level that disturbs the gods. The problem is not one battle or one ruler. It is accumulation. Archaeological records from early urban centers show periods of rapid growth followed by collapse or transformation. Cities such as Uruk expanded dramatically in the 4th millennium BCE, with increased population density, monumental building, and administrative complexity. Scholars note that such growth often brings strain on resources and social systems. Texts from these regions sometimes remember earlier times as dominated by figures of great strength or authority, without recording their daily governance. Memory compresses complexity into figures. In the Biblical Scouts report in Numbers 13, size becomes a tool of comparison. The Scouts say that the inhabitants of the land appear larger than themselves, and they invoke the Nephilim name to communicate fear. The text presents this as perception rather than fact. Moses and the narrative later challenge the reliability of the report. The Nephilim reference here functions as a symbol of overwhelming opposition. It does not establish a historical continuity with Genesis. It shows how the name could be reused to express vulnerability. This reuse is central to how memory operates across generations. A rare term gains weight precisely because it is rare. Each time it appears, it carries echoes of previous contexts. Over centuries, those echoes accumulate. By the time later readers imagine an age ruled by Nephilim, they are responding to accumulated associations rather than to explicit description. Size suggests power. Power suggests violence. Violence suggests an unlivable world. Ancient historiography often works this way. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, records stories of peoples and rulers described as unusually large or long-lived. Modern historians treat these descriptions cautiously, understanding them as markers of otherness or distance rather than measurements. The farther a people is from the writer's own experience, the more likely their bodies and customs are to be described as extreme. This pattern appears across cultures and periods. In later Christian and Jewish art, giants are depicted visually as towering figures. These images reflect interpretive traditions rather than textual detail. Medieval manuscripts illustrate David and Goliath with exaggerated proportions, even though the biblical text gives limited physical description. The visual language communicates moral and narrative contrast, not anatomy. Similar visual habits shaped how Nephilim were imagined, especially once the term giant became fixed in translation. Scholarly treatments in the modern period often return to the problem of definition. Lexicons note that Nephilim is a hapax legomenon, a word that appears very rarely. Its meaning must be inferred from context rather than from usage patterns. Context, in this case, is sparse. The surrounding verses speak of intermarriage, renown, and violence. They do not speak of governance structures or ecological conditions. The link between size and an uninhabitable world is therefore interpretive rather than descriptive. Anthropological studies of myth suggest that societies use figures of exaggerated size to encode collective anxiety. Large bodies stand for large forces. They make abstract problems visible. In that sense, the Nephilim name may function as a memory marker for a time perceived as overwhelming. The text does not instruct readers to imagine starvation, crushed cities, or constant terror. It names a condition and moves on. The restraint of the earlier sources is consistent across manuscript traditions. Neither Hebrew nor Greek versions expand the description of violence into scenes. Neither assigns the Nephilim specific actions. The connection between their name and the state of the earth remains implicit. That implicit link is strong enough to be remembered, but weak enough to resist precise reconstruction. When modern discussions claim that humans would not survive a day in such a world, they are projecting contemporary assumptions about biology and environment onto ancient narrative signals. The ancient texts themselves do not operate at that level. They describe a remembered age through names, conditions, and boundaries. Size and violence are linked as concepts, not as variables in an experiment. What survives in the record is a pattern of association. Great figures appear. Violence is named. A boundary event follows. Memory retains the outline and discards the details. The Nephilim occupy that outline as a signpost, rather than as a fully rendered population. Their association with size and violence reflects how ancient cultures encoded the idea of excess without specifying its mechanics, what the earth is said to endure. In Genesis 6, the condition of the earth is described before any judgment is narrated. The language used does not focus on individual actions or isolated failures. It speaks of the earth as a whole. The text states that the earth was corrupt and filled with violence, using terms that apply to systems rather than events. The subject is not a city, a tribe, or a ruler. It is the land itself, treated as a collective space shaped by what occurs upon it. The Hebrew term translated as corrupt, shashat, appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in contexts involving spoilage, decay, or irreversible damage. It is used for ruined objects, broken agreements, and moral collapse. When applied to the earth, it does not suggest physical erosion or environmental catastrophe in a modern sense. It suggests a state in which normal order can no longer function as intended. The earth is presented as affected, not merely as a backdrop. This way of speaking is not unique to Genesis. In Leviticus, the land is said to react to certain behaviors, even to the point of expelling its inhabitants. The language frames land as responsive rather than passive. In prophetic books, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, the earth mourns, languishes, or becomes desolate in response to sustained injustice. These expressions do not describe geological processes. They describe perceived imbalance between human activity and the stability of communal life. In the pre-flood narrative, the earth's condition is stated without examples. No crops are described as failing. No rivers are named as polluted. The reader is told only that the state of the earth has reached a point that cannot continue. This approach keeps attention on condition rather than cause. It allows the narrative to move forward without becoming a catalogue. Ancient Near Eastern literature uses similar framing. In the Atrahasis epic, preserved on Akkadian tablets dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE, the problem that leads to the flood is described as noise and disturbance. Humanity multiplies, and their collective presence disrupts the divine order. The land itself is not described as physically altered, but the system is no longer tolerable. The response is a reset rather than a repair. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative as well, preserved most fully in tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. In that account, the gods regret the destruction afterward, but the reason for it is presented briefly. As in Genesis, the emphasis is on threshold rather than detail. In Genesis 6, the earth is also said to be filled. This framing removes the possibility that reform or correction is already underway. The condition is total within the narrative logic. The earth is described as bearing the cumulative weight of human behavior over time, rather than reacting to a single generation. Later interpreters sometimes treated this language as metaphorical, while others took it more literally. Rabbinic discussions preserved in Midrash often explore what corruption could mean in practical terms, such as unjust measurements, theft, or exploitation. These interpretations remain speculative within the text itself. They reflect later concerns about social order rather than details supplied by Genesis. The Nephilim reference appears earlier in the same chapter, but the description of the earth does not return to them. The text does not say that the earth was corrupted because of them. It does not assign responsibility. It presents multiple observations in sequence and then proceeds. This separation suggests that the narrative does not intend a simple chain of cause and effect. It records conditions as they were remembered or understood. In ancient cosmology, the earth was often seen as a structured space with limits and expectations. Mesopotamian texts describe land grants, boundary stones, and divine assignments of territory. Disorder in human society was thought to ripple outward, affecting agriculture, weather, and fertility. These ideas do not rely on scientific causation. They rely on the assumption that order is maintained through balance. Biblical language reflects this assumption without systematizing it. When the earth is said to be corrupt, the reader is not instructed on how to fix it. The narrative does not pause for reform. It moves toward removal and preservation. The focus shifts to Noah, whose description emphasizes personal conduct rather than leadership or innovation. The earth remains in the background, defined by its state rather than its features. The absence of environmental description is notable. The pre-flood world is not depicted as lush or barren. It is not said to be overpopulated or resource depleted. The text avoids sensory detail. This avoidance suggests that the condition of the earth is conceptual rather than visual. Outside the Bible, ancient writers sometimes linked moral decline with physical disorder more explicitly. Hesiod, writing in Greece around the 8th century BCE, described a sequence of ages in which human behavior worsens over time. In his Works and Days, later ages are marked by injustice and suffering. The earth's productivity declines alongside human conduct. These descriptions are schematic, not observational. They provide a framework for understanding change rather than a report of conditions. In the Genesis account, the earth's endurance reaches a limit. The narrative does not describe gradual deterioration. It states a condition and moves to resolution. This approach aligns with genealogical time, which compresses long spans into brief statements. The Earth's experience is summarized rather than narrated. Modern readers sometimes seek to interpret these passages through the lens of environmental history. Attempts have been made to correlate flood narratives with evidence of ancient flooding in the Tigris-Euphrates basin or other regions. These efforts are cautious and localized. They do not claim that textual descriptions of corruption correspond to measurable environmental collapse. The language of Genesis does not support such precision. What remains consistent across textual traditions is the portrayal of the earth as a participant in the narrative. It is not merely the setting for human action, it is described as bearing, filling, and reaching a state that necessitates change. This portrayal reflects an ancient worldview in which land, society, and order are inseparable. The Earth's condition is described before any technical solution is introduced. The arc narrative that follows is specific and practical, but it addresses preservation rather than repair. The Earth itself is not healed within the text. It is cleared and later reoccupied. The emphasis is on continuity of life rather than restoration of the previous state. In later biblical passages, the memory of the flood shapes how land is discussed. Covenantal language in Genesis 9 includes promises about stability, seasons, and restraint. These assurances are framed in response to what preceded them. The earlier description of corruption provides the contrast that gives later promises their function. Without that description, the covenant would lack context. The Nephilim are not mentioned again in connection with the earth's endurance. Their role in the narrative remains limited to their appearance and to later echoes in other texts. The condition of the earth stands on its own as a statement about limits. It does not require further explanation to serve its narrative purpose. Ancient texts often preserve memory through condition statements rather than through chronicles. They name what could no longer be sustained. They avoid describing daily life, focusing instead on thresholds and transitions. The earth, in Genesis 6, is described in this way. It is said to endure corruption and saturation. It is not shown responding moment by moment. This form of description resists reconstruction. It provides no measurements, no timelines, and no scenes. It offers a stable phrase that can be repeated across generations. The earth is corrupt. The earth is filled. They allow the story to move forward without inviting technical analysis. The endurance of the earth, as presented in the text, is therefore a conceptual limit rather than a physical one. It marks the point at which the existing order cannot continue. The narrative does not ask how long the earth endured this state, nor does it ask what it looked like. It records that it did, and that the record was preserved. Lives measured without clocks. In the early chapters of Genesis, time is recorded through lives rather than through dates. Years are counted, but they are attached to names, births, and deaths instead of to seasons or external events. The genealogies from Adam to Noah follow a fixed pattern. A man lives a certain number of years, fathers a son, continues to live, and then dies. The repetition is deliberate. It creates a rhythm that replaces the need for a calendar. These lifespans are unusually long when compared with later biblical figures. Adam is said to live 930 years. Seth lives 912. Methuselah reaches 969. The text does not explain why these numbers are so high. It does not compare them to later norms. It presents them as facts within the narrative frame. The effect is to place early humanity in a different temporal condition without defining the mechanics of that difference. Ancient readers did not necessarily treat these numbers as biological data. In many ancient cultures, numbers carried symbolic weight alongside practical meaning. Large figures could signal antiquity, honor, or closeness to origins. Mesopotamian king lists, for example, assign reigns of tens of thousands of years to early rulers before a flood. After the flood, reign lengths decrease sharply. The structure mirrors the Genesis genealogies in broad outline, though the details differ. Both traditions use longevity to mark distance from the present. The genealogies in Genesis are tightly structured. Each entry follows the same sequence of information, with minimal variation. This structure emphasizes continuity rather than individuality. The people named are less important than the chain they form. The long lifespans stretch the chain backward, creating a sense of depth without providing narrative detail. The text does not describe how these individuals lived day to day, what they ate, or how they organized their communities. Time measured through lives rather than through clocks reflects a world without fixed civic calendars. In later biblical books, time is marked by festivals, reigns of kings, and dated events. In the antediluvian period, none of these markers appear. There are no named cities with founding dates. There are no recorded wars with durations. The passage of time is personal and generational. This method of timekeeping also appears in other ancient traditions. In early Greek myth, heroes are often situated relative to each other by lineage rather than by year. Hesiod's genealogies of gods and mortals establish sequence without absolute dating. The same approach appears in early Irish and Norse genealogical material. Time becomes a function of descent, not of measurement. The absence of clocks or calendars in these texts does not imply that ancient people lacked ways of tracking time. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient societies observed seasons, lunar cycles, and agricultural rhythms. What is absent in the Genesis genealogies is the decision to anchor the narrative to those systems. The choice to measure time through lives serves a literary and mnemonic purpose. It simplifies the record while extending its reach. The Nephilim reference appears within this genealogical framework, but does not disrupt it. The mention occurs in Genesis 6, after several generations have already been listed. The text does not attach lifespans to the Nephilim. It does not state how long they lived or whether they followed the same pattern as other figures. Their presence is noted without integration into the temporal system that governs the rest of the chapter. This separation is consistent with how rare terms are handled elsewhere in the Bible. When a word or figure appears briefly, it is often left outside the main structural devices. The genealogies continue unaffected. Time flows according to births and deaths, not according to extraordinary beings. This suggests that the primary concern of the text is continuity of lineage rather than cataloging anomalies. Later, interpreters sometimes attempted to reconcile the long lifespans with known human limits. Some proposed gradual shortening of life after the flood. Others suggested that years were counted differently. These explanations appear in medieval commentaries and early modern discussions. The biblical text itself does not offer such adjustments. It presents the numbers plainly and moves on. In the Hebrew language, the word used for years in these passages is the same word used elsewhere for ordinary years. There is no linguistic marker indicating a different unit of time. This has been noted by modern scholars who caution against assuming alternative measurements without textual support. The text's consistency suggests that the numbers are meant to be read within the narrative world as given. The effect of these extended lifespans is cumulative. By the time the narrative reaches Noah, only a small number of generations have passed, yet an immense span of time is implied. This compression allows the story to cover origins, corruption, and transition without expanding into multiple narrative arcs. The reader is carried across centuries in a few pages. In such a framework, survival is not described in terms of daily endurance. The text does not ask whether a human could survive a certain number of hours or days. It assumes that life continues across centuries until a boundary is reached. The boundary is not biological exhaustion. It is narrative necessity. The flood marks a reset point where the rules of time appear to change. After the flood, lifespans begin to decrease. The genealogies in Genesis 11 show a steady reduction, with figures living hundreds rather than nearly 1,000 years. By the time the narrative reaches Abraham, lifespans are closer to those recorded in later history. The text does not comment on this change. It allows the numbers themselves to signal transition. This shift reinforces the idea that time before the flood operates under different conditions. Those conditions are not defined in physical terms. They are defined through narrative contrast. Long lives belong to the early world. Shorter lives belong to the later one. The Nephilim reference remains tied to the earlier phase, without temporal markers of its own. In ancient historical writing, such techniques were common. Early periods were often described with broad strokes and exaggerated spans, while later periods received more detailed treatment. This does not indicate deception. It reflects priorities. What mattered about the earliest times was their position at the beginning, not their internal chronology. Modern historiography relies on absolute dating, synchronized calendars, and material evidence. The Genesis genealogies operate on a different logic. They provide sequence without scale. They establish order without measurement. This logic resists translation into modern timelines without distortion. The calm presentation of these lifespans contributes to the overall tone of the narrative. There is no emphasis on marvel or disbelief. The numbers are stated without comment. The reader is not instructed to react. This restraint is consistent with the handling of other extraordinary elements in the early chapters. The Nephilim, placed within this temporal environment, are part of a world where time stretches and compresses according to narrative need. The text does not indicate that their presence alters the flow of time. It does not suggest that their era is shorter or more intense in measurable units. It simply places them before the boundary and moves on. When later traditions imagine the pre-flood world as hostile or unendurable, they often translate narrative distance into physical difficulty. The original text does not make that move. It measures existence through generations, not through strain. The endurance implied is temporal rather than physiological. Lives measured without clocks create a sense of remoteness that cannot be easily mapped onto modern experience. The early world is far not because it is dangerous, but because it is temporally vast and structurally simple. The absence of detailed markers keeps it beyond reconstruction. What remains is a pattern. Long lives establish depth. Short statements mark condition. A boundary event resets the system. The Nephilim reference sits within that pattern as a name remembered rather than a variable measured. Time flows past them without pause, recorded only through the quiet repetition of birth and death. Places named, landscapes unseen. In the earliest chapters of Genesis, geography is introduced sparingly. Places are named, but they are not described. Rivers are listed, lands are referenced, and boundaries are implied, yet the text avoids sensory detail. This pattern holds in the passages surrounding the Nephilim reference. The Earth is discussed as a whole, and specific locations remain largely unmarked. The absence of description is consistent and deliberate. Genesis 2 names 4 rivers associated with Eden: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Of these, only the last 2 can be identified with confidence today. The text gives brief directional notes but does not describe terrain, vegetation, or settlement. The rivers serve as anchors of memory rather than as guides for reconstruction. Their naming suggests familiarity to the original audience, even if their precise locations were already uncertain. After Eden, geography recedes further. Cain is said to settle in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The name Nod is linked etymologically to wandering, not to a mapped region. No borders are drawn. No distances are given. The land functions as a narrative marker rather than a physical space. It identifies movement away from origins without inviting visualization. As genealogies progress, place names appear only when they serve lineage or separation. The Earth is populated, but it is not mapped. Cities are mentioned by name, such as Enoch, but without description. The reader is not told what these cities look like, how large they are, or where they sit in relation to one another. The text does not linger. It names and moves on. The Nephilim passage in Genesis 6 contains no place names at all. The statement, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days," is global in scope and minimal in detail. It does not associate them with a region, a river system, or a settlement. The phrase "on the earth" does not distinguish between cultivated land, wilderness, or coast. It presents presence without location. This approach contrasts with later biblical narratives. In the stories of the patriarchs, geography becomes more concrete. Locations such as Shechem, Bethel, and Hebron are named repeatedly. Travel routes are implied. Wells are described. Boundaries matter. These details support covenantal claims tied to land. In the antediluvian material, no such claims are being made. The narrative interest lies elsewhere. Ancient Near Eastern texts often follow a similar pattern when dealing with primordial time. In the Sumerian king list, early rulers are named, and cities are sometimes listed, but descriptions are absent. The cities function as seats of authority rather than as physical environments. Archaeology can identify sites associated with some of these names, but the texts themselves do not guide excavation. They preserve memory, not topography. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes named locations such as Uruk, the cedar forest, and the waters of death. Even there, description is selective. Uruk is praised for its walls, but the cedar forest remains vague, defined more by danger than by geography. When the flood narrative appears, the setting dissolves almost entirely. The world is covered by water, and place loses meaning. This loss mirrors the Genesis flood, where geography is erased rather than transformed. In Genesis, the lack of environmental detail before the flood reinforces the sense that the early world is not meant to be pictured. It is meant to be positioned in time and condition. The earth exists, it is populated, and it reaches a limit. Specific landscapes would anchor the narrative too firmly in material space. By avoiding them, the text maintains distance. Later traditions attempted to fill this gap. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic writers speculated about the location of Eden and the lands before the flood. Medieval maps sometimes placed Eden at the eastern edge of the known world or beyond it entirely. These maps reflect theological imagination rather than inherited description. They respond to the silence of the text rather than to hidden detail within it. Archaeological efforts to identify antediluvian sites face the same limitation. Without descriptions, there is nothing to correlate. No building materials are named, no tools are listed, no crops are identified. The absence of such information is not due to loss. It reflects the genre and purpose of the material. The early chapters of Genesis are not concerned with documenting settlement patterns. The Nephilim reference remains detached from geography, even in later echoes. In Numbers 13, the scouts mention the Nephilim in connection with the land of Canaan. This is a new context, separated by narrative time and purpose. The land is described as producing large fruit and housing fortified cities. The Nephilim name is used there as a comparison, not as a claim that the same beings occupy the same space. The reuse of the name does not establish continuity of place. This separation highlights how names can travel without landscapes. A term can carry meaning across contexts without dragging its original setting along with it. In ancient literature, this mobility is common. Heroes, monsters, and divine figures appear in multiple locations without fixed geography. Their significance lies in what they represent, not in where they live. The lack of geographic anchoring also affects how later readers imagine survival. Without terrain, climate, or resources, it is impossible to assess conditions in practical terms. The text does not say whether the land was fertile or hostile. It does not say whether humans clustered in cities or spread across plains. It does not say how they interacted with animals or weather. Any attempt to reconstruct such details comes from outside the text. Modern readers often assume that a world associated with giants and violence must be physically dangerous. Ancient texts do not make that assumption explicit. Danger is described in social and moral terms, not environmental ones. The earth is corrupt, not barren. Violence fills it, not famine or disease. These distinctions matter when evaluating what the text actually claims. In later biblical poetry, land is sometimes described in vivid imagery. Psalmists speak of mountains trembling and rivers clapping their hands. Prophets describe fields withering and cities becoming desolate. These images are tied to specific historical moments and judgments. The antediluvian narrative does not employ such imagery. Its restraint sets it apart. The decision to leave landscapes unseen allows the narrative to function across generations. Readers in different regions can engage the story without needing to reconcile it with local geography. The Earth becomes a conceptual stage rather than a mapped one. This universality may explain why the text avoids description. It does not belong to one land. It precedes all later claims. Scholars of biblical literature note that naming without describing is a common technique in foundational narratives. Names establish order and memory. Description establishes attachment. The early chapters aim for the former. They introduce figures, conditions, and boundaries that shape later thought without tying them to specific environments. The Nephilim, as named beings, fit this pattern. They are placed on the earth without coordinates. Their presence is asserted without scene. This makes them difficult to localize and difficult to eliminate from memory. They remain as a reference point rather than as an inhabitant of a known place. When later traditions imagine the pre-flood world, they often supply landscapes that reflect their own environments. Mountains, forests, and cities are added according to cultural familiarity. These additions reveal more about the imaginer than about the source. The original text remains unchanged, silent on such matters. The absence of landscape detail also limits the scope of claims that can be made responsibly. Without description, there is no basis for asserting specific environmental pressures. The text does not support statements about temperature, gravity, or atmospheric composition. It does not frame the early world as physically uninhabitable. It frames it as narratively distant. In this way, the unseen landscapes of Genesis function as a boundary. They prevent overreach while allowing reflection. The earth is named, judged, and reset, but it is not pictured. The Nephilim move within this unnamed space, defined by their mention rather than by their surroundings. The restraint of the text has preserved its flexibility. It has allowed the narrative to endure across languages and cultures without requiring reinterpretation of geography. The earth before the flood remains a concept rather than a place. Renown without record. Genesis 6-4 includes a brief phrase that has carried disproportionate weight in later interpretation. The text states that certain figures were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The wording is compact and unelaborated. No deeds are listed. No victories, buildings, or laws are attributed. The statement functions as a label rather than a report. It records reputation without preserving the actions that produced it. The Hebrew term often translated as mighty is gibborim. Elsewhere in the Bible, this word is used for warriors, strong individuals, or people of social standing. David's elite soldiers are called gibborim, as are hunters and fighters in later narratives. The term identifies capacity and status, not anatomy. When Genesis applies it to figures in the early world, It does so without modifying its usual range of meaning. The phrase men of renown uses the Hebrew Shem, meaning name. To have a name is to be known, remembered, or spoken of. In ancient societies with limited written records, reputation traveled orally. A name carried weight when stories circulated about it, even if those stories were not written down. Genesis preserves the fact of renown without attempting to preserve the stories themselves. This pattern appears throughout ancient literature. Early Mesopotamian texts refer to kings whose names were famous, but whose deeds are summarized or omitted. In the Sumerian king list, rulers are named alongside the length of their reigns, but their actions are not described. The list assumes that the act of ruling and the duration of authority are sufficient markers of significance. Details are unnecessary for the text's purpose. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the protagonist's renown is introduced before his actions are narrated. The poem opens by calling attention to his fame and urging the reader to learn his story. In Genesis, the process is reversed. Renown is stated, and the story moves on without fulfillment. The text does not invite the reader to seek further detail. It treats the existence of reputation as an endpoint. Ancient Hebrew narrative often avoids elaboration where later readers expect it. The Bible frequently records outcomes without documenting processes. Victories are stated without battle descriptions. Deaths are noted without circumstances. This economy of detail reflects a tradition that values continuity and meaning over completeness. The early chapters of Genesis apply this approach consistently. The figures described as renowned in Genesis 6 are not named individually. This absence is notable. Elsewhere, when individuals matter to the narrative, they are named. Adam, Noah, and their descendants are listed carefully. The unnamed men of renown remain collective. Their identity is subsumed under reputation rather than preserved through genealogy. This anonymity limits what can be inferred. Without names, there can be no cross-referencing with other traditions. Without deeds, there can be no comparison. The text preserves only the fact that they were remembered. It does not preserve why. This suggests that the memory itself mattered more than its content. In later Jewish and Christian writings, authors sometimes attempted to supply what Genesis withheld. Enochic literature describes violent acts and social disruption associated with giant figures. Other texts speculate about forbidden knowledge or technological misuse. These expansions reflect interpretive traditions rather than textual necessity. They respond to silence by adding narrative, not by uncovering hidden detail. The restraint of Genesis contrasts with royal inscriptions from the ancient Near East. Assyrian kings carved lengthy accounts of their campaigns into stone, listing conquered cities and defeated enemies. These inscriptions aimed to secure renown through record. Genesis records renown without inscription. It relies on transmission rather than documentation. This difference reflects distinct purposes. Royal inscriptions function as propaganda and commemoration. Genesis functions as foundational narrative. It establishes categories and boundaries rather than celebrating achievement. The men of renown serve as a category marker within the pre-flood world. They indicate that reputation and power existed, but they do not define the direction of the story. The placement of the renown phrase is also significant. It follows the mention of unions and precedes the statement about violence. The text does not explicitly connect these elements. It presents them sequentially. Later readers often infer causation from sequence, but the text itself maintains separation. Renown is stated, violence is stated. The narrative proceeds. In anthropological studies of oral cultures, reputation often outlasts context. Names and titles survive while actions fade. Epic traditions condense complex histories into recognizable figures. Over time, the figures remain, while the circumstances that produced them are lost. Genesis reflects a similar dynamic. It preserves the echo of fame without preserving its source. The Hebrew Bible elsewhere treats the pursuit of a name as a significant motive. In Genesis 11, the builders of the tower say, "Let us make a name for ourselves." The phrase implies permanence and recognition. The tower narrative ends with dispersion and loss of unified reputation. In Genesis 6, the men of renown already possess a name. The text does not evaluate this condition, it records it. Later biblical authors sometimes contrast human renown with divine action. Psalmists note that human names fade while divine memory endures. These reflections belong to later theological development. Genesis 6 does not engage in such contrast. It does not judge renown as good or bad. It notes its presence in a world nearing transition. The lack of record also affects how modern readers imagine scale. Without deeds, renown can expand in imagination. The absence of constraint allows later traditions to inflate significance. Figures become rulers, giants, or tyrants in retelling. The original text does not authorize these expansions. It simply does not prevent them. In historical methodology, absence of evidence limits claims. When a source states that figures were renowned, but does not say why, a cautious reading stops there. It acknowledges reputation without reconstructing action. This approach aligns with how ancient texts are treated in other contexts. When Homer mentions heroes known for past deeds without recounting them, historians do not assume specific events without corroboration. The Genesis account remains consistent with this restraint. It records that renown existed before the flood. It does not suggest that renown structured society or governance. There is no indication of rule, hierarchy, or administration tied to these figures. The idea of a world ruled by them emerges from later synthesis rather than from the text itself. The use of the plural form further generalizes the statement. These were not singular rulers, but a group remembered collectively. Collective memory often preserves categories rather than biographies. The text reflects that pattern. It treats renown as a feature of the age rather than as the achievement of individuals. This treatment aligns with how the early chapters of Genesis handle other elements. Violence is generalized. Corruption is generalized. The earth's condition is generalized. Specific cases are absent. The narrative operates at the level of conditions and categories. Renown fits within that framework. In later historical periods, record-keeping increases. Names are tied to actions. Kings are dated. Cities are described. The shift from generalized renown to documented achievement marks a transition in how societies remember themselves. Genesis situates the pre-flood world before that transition. Reputation exists, but record does not. The phrase "of old" reinforces this distance. It marks the figures as belonging to an earlier, undefined time. The expression does not specify how far back. It signals antiquity rather than chronology. This language appears elsewhere in the Bible to describe ancient customs or long-standing practices. It functions as a temporal marker without measurement. When modern narratives imagine the pre-flood world as dominated by renowned figures, they often convert reputation into control. The text does not make that conversion. It leaves renown unanchored. The figures are known, but their influence is not mapped. This distinction matters for understanding what the source actually conveys. The preservation of renown without record allows the text to acknowledge memory while avoiding endorsement. It notes that these figures were remembered without explaining why they deserved remembrance. This neutrality is consistent with the overall tone of the early chapters. Observation replaces commentary. The Nephilim are associated with this renown, but the association remains indirect. The text does not state that all renowned figures were Nephilim, or that all Nephilim were renowned. It places the ideas near each other and moves on. This proximity has fueled interpretation, but it does not amount to definition. The result is a layered silence. Names exist without biographies. Reputation exists without record. Memory exists without narrative. This silence has proven durable. It has allowed the text to be transmitted across centuries without requiring amendment. It has also allowed imagination to grow around it. From a textual perspective, the restraint is stable. Manuscripts across traditions preserve the same wording. There is no evidence of missing lines or damaged sections where deeds were once recorded. The absence appears intentional rather than accidental. Renown without record functions as a marker of a world remembered differently. It signals that early human history, as presented here, is not accessible through documentation. It is accessible only through names, conditions, and boundaries. The flood that follows erases even those minimal traces. The narrative does not pause to mourn the loss of record. It proceeds to preservation and renewal. The unnamed, renowned figures disappear from the account. Their memory survives only in the phrase that notes it existed, when continuity replaces power. After the brief description of the Nephilim and the men of renown, the Genesis narrative shifts direction without explanation. The text does not announce a new theme or argue against what came before. It simply narrows its focus. The attention moves away from collective conditions and unnamed figures and settles on a single household. Power and reputation are no longer referenced. Continuity becomes the organizing concern. Noah is introduced in restrained language. He is described as righteous and blameless in his generation and as one who walked with God. These phrases are not developed further. The text does not describe his influence, wealth, or standing among others. There is no reference to fear, admiration, or authority. Noah's significance is established quietly, through character rather than recognition. This change is reinforced structurally. Genesis 6-9 opens with a genealogical marker. These are the generations of Noah. The same formula has already been used earlier in the book to move the narrative forward. Its function is consistent. It signals a return to lineage as the framework through which time and meaning are organized. What follows is no longer a description of the earth as a whole, but the preservation of a line. The instructions given to Noah mark another shift. For the first time since the creation account, the text becomes precise. Measurements are provided, materials are specified. The ark is described in terms of length, width, and height. These details stand in contrast to the earlier lack of description regarding society, geography, or the renowned figures themselves. Where power and reputation were stated without detail, preservation is explained carefully. The ark is not framed as a symbol of authority. It is presented as a functional structure. Its purpose is transport, not display. It does not elevate Noah above others socially. It isolates him. The narrative does not mention followers, opposition, or persuasion. This pattern aligns with other ancient flood traditions. In the Atrahasis epic, a single figure is warned privately and instructed to preserve life. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives the flood, but does not return to rebuild society as a ruler. His survival grants him distance from the world, rather than control over it. Genesis follows the same logic. Survival does not translate into dominance. The earlier figures described as mighty or renowned disappear entirely. They are not named again. The text does not compare them to Noah or explain why one group fades while another persists. The absence is complete and unmarked. The narrative does not require contrast to establish priority. It simply proceeds with what remains relevant to continuity. After the flood, genealogies resume immediately. Genesis chapters 9 and 10 list descendants, nations, and lines of descent. The focus is on multiplication and distribution rather than achievement. Peoples are traced to ancestors. Lands are associated with names. There is no evaluation of strength or fame. The framework is relational, not hierarchical. This emphasis reflects a broader ancient concern with survival through descent. In cultures where written records were limited, continuity depended on family lines. A name that could be transmitted mattered more than deeds that could be forgotten. Genesis encodes this value by structuring history around generations rather than around rulers or victories. The covenant introduced in Genesis 9 reinforces this orientation. It is extended to Noah, his descendants, and all living creatures. Its sign is not a constructed object or a seat of power. It is a recurring feature of the natural world. The covenant guarantees stability rather than authority. Seasons will continue. Life will persist. Boundaries are established without hierarchy. The language of the covenant avoids elevation. Noah is not crowned or distinguished above others in status. He is positioned as a carrier of continuity, not as a founder of dominance. The instructions that follow concern restraint and accountability, not expansion or control. Human power is limited rather than extended. This shift also alters how time is experienced in the narrative. Post-flood genealogies show shorter lifespans. Generations succeed one another more quickly. History becomes denser. This change is not explained. It is simply recorded. Continuity now depends on succession rather than on extended individual presence. As time compresses, memory changes. Reputation without record becomes harder to sustain. Later figures gain recognition through named actions, dated reigns, and preserved words. Kings are measured by years. Prophets are remembered through speech. The unnamed renown of the pre-flood world belongs to a different narrative condition. Archaeological records from the ancient Near East show a similar pattern. Earlier periods are sparsely documented, while later societies produce administrative texts, inscriptions, and legal records. Authority becomes tied to documentation. Genesis mirrors this shift in narrative form. After the flood, names and places multiply, and detail increases. By redirecting attention toward lineage and preservation, the text limits speculation about earlier power structures. It does not preserve enough information to reconstruct a pre-flood hierarchy. What does not contribute to continuity is allowed to disappear from the account. The transition is calm and unmarked. There is no condemnation of renown and no celebration of humility. The narrative does not argue. It replaces one organizing principle with another through omission. Power recedes. Continuity takes its place. The Nephilim and the men of renown do not return. Their absence is not explained. Within the logic of the text, explanation is unnecessary. The story has moved on to what can be carried forward. The line that persists becomes the history that follows. The silence that followed the flood. After the waters recede, the Genesis narrative does not pause to reflect on what has been lost. There is no description of ruins, abandoned settlements, or erased cultures. The text moves forward without accounting for absence. This silence is consistent and deliberate. The post-flood world is introduced without commentary on recovery, grief, or memory. The first actions recorded after the flood are practical. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices. The act is stated plainly, without description of emotion or ceremony. The text does not frame this moment as catharsis or relief. It is recorded as a response, not as an expression. The narrative remains observational. What is not said is as important as what is included. There is no inventory of survivors beyond Noah's family. There is no mention of former cities, tools, or practices needing restoration. The reader is not told how knowledge is preserved, or whether anything of the previous world is remembered consciously. The silence leaves no bridge between what existed before and what begins after. This lack of detail stands in contrast to later biblical stories of destruction. When Jerusalem falls in Kings and Chronicles, the text records plundered objects, burned buildings, and displaced people. Prophetic books dwell on loss and exile. The flood narrative offers none of this. The scale of destruction is greater, yet the description is more restrained. Ancient Near Eastern flood traditions show a similar pattern. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, after the flood subsides, Utnapishtim releases birds and offers sacrifice. The gods gather, and regret is expressed briefly. There is no description of rebuilding or of remembering those who died. The narrative turns away from loss and toward resolution. In Genesis, the silence continues through the covenant section. The promises made concern the future, not the past. The language focuses on stability and repetition. Seasons will continue. Life will reproduce. The earth will not be destroyed again in the same way. These assurances are forward-facing. They do not reference what preceded them. The narrative does not preserve any explicit memory of the Nephilim or the men of renown after the flood. Their absence is total. There is no warning not to repeat their ways. There is no acknowledgement that such figures once existed. The silence functions as erasure rather than condemnation. This approach aligns with how genealogical texts often function. They prioritize continuation over recollection. What matters is that a line persists, not what it replaces. The genealogies that follow list names and descendants without commentary on what knowledge is retained from earlier times. Memory is assumed to restart with those who survive. In Genesis 9, the covenant includes restrictions on violence and the taking of life. These boundaries are introduced without explicit reference to prior conditions. The reader may infer contrast, but the text does not state it. The silence prevents direct comparison. It allows the new order to stand on its own terms. The story of Noah's vineyard follows shortly after. It is a small, domestic episode. It does not depict rebuilding society or reclaiming lost authority. It shows ordinary human activity and its complications. The scale is reduced. The narrative remains close to individual action rather than collective memory. Ancient historiography often handles catastrophic transitions this way. Large breaks are followed by simplified accounts. Complexity is reduced, details are withheld. This allows a new structure to emerge without being burdened by unresolved pasts. Genesis reflects this pattern. The silence also limits the scope of interpretation. Without descriptions of immediate aftermath, later readers cannot anchor speculation about technology, culture, or environment. The text provides no evidence for advanced systems needing restoration or for lost knowledge being transmitted. Claims about such matters arise from later imagination rather than from narrative content. In the Table of Nations, the world repopulates through named descendants. Lands are associated with peoples. Languages divide. These developments are recorded without reference to what existed before. The flood functions as a boundary beyond which earlier arrangements are irrelevant to the unfolding story. This silence does not imply forgetfulness. It implies selectivity. The narrative chooses not to carry certain elements forward. The omission shapes memory by exclusion. What is not preserved cannot influence later identity within the text. Scholars note that ancient foundational narratives often operate this way. They establish beginnings by removing continuity with what preceded them. This makes the present intelligible, without requiring reconciliation with a distant and undefined past. The flood narrative performs this function by resetting both population and memory. The calm tone of the post-flood account reinforces this effect. There is no urgency. No warning is issued. No explanation is demanded. The reader is carried forward quietly. The silence becomes part of the structure. When later traditions seek to recover what was lost, they do so outside the biblical text. Apocryphal writings, folklore, and speculative histories attempt to fill the gap. The Genesis account remains unchanged. Its silence remains intact across manuscript traditions. This silence also affects how survival is framed. The narrative does not suggest that survival was difficult or miraculous in a physical sense. It presents survival as a given outcome of obedience and preservation. The absence of struggle reinforces the shift away from power and spectacle. In this way, the post-flood world begins without commentary. The story continues as though silence itself has cleared the ground. What follows is not shaped by what was endured, but by what persists, a world narrowed to one line. After the flood, the Genesis narrative does not expand outward to describe a renewed global society. It contracts. Attention shifts from humanity as a whole to a limited set of names. The story advances by narrowing focus rather than by rebuilding complexity. This narrowing is not explained or justified. It is presented as the natural movement of the account. Genesis 10 lists descendants of Noah's sons in what later tradition calls the Table of Nations. The chapter names peoples and regions, but it does so without description. Names are paired with territories, and territories are linked to lines of descent. There are no scenes, no dialogue, and no evaluation. The list functions as a map of relationships rather than as a record of activity. The world is repopulated in outline form. This listing gives the appearance of breadth, but its structure already implies selection. The names are arranged to move toward one line that will soon receive sustained attention. The narrative does not follow all branches equally. Some names appear once and never return. Others reappear as anchors for later stories. The process of narrowing begins quietly within the list itself. The next shift occurs in Genesis 11, where genealogy resumes in a more focused form. The pattern used earlier in Genesis returns: a name, an age, a son, and a lifespan. This structure reduces the field again. From the many names of nations, the story selects a single chain. The rest recede into background reference. They remain named, but inactive. This narrowing is a narrative choice rather than a historical claim. The text does not say that other peoples disappear or become unimportant in their own contexts. It simply chooses not to follow them. The story's continuity depends on one line, not on comprehensive coverage. What matters is transmission, not representation. The tower account that interrupts this genealogy briefly widens the frame again, but only to explain division. Humanity is depicted as unified, speaking one language and acting collectively. The description remains minimal. The city is not detailed. The tower's design is not described. The narrative focuses on intent rather than on construction. The episode ends with dispersion and the multiplication of languages. This dispersion reinforces the narrowing that follows. After languages are divided, the narrative returns to genealogy. The scattering explains why the story can now follow one line without addressing the others. Diversity is acknowledged and then set aside. The text moves forward along a chosen path. The line that continues from Genesis 11 leads to Abram. His introduction is brief. He is named within a genealogy before he is ever depicted as a character. This ordering matters. Identity precedes action. Lineage establishes relevance before narrative detail appears. The world narrows again, from a family to an individual. Throughout this process, the text avoids comparison. It does not state that the selected line is stronger, wiser, or more deserving. Selection occurs without commentary. The absence of explanation prevents the narrowing from becoming a judgment. This method reflects how ancient genealogies functioned. They were tools for tracing inheritance, obligation, and memory. They did not aim to record all people equally. They preserved what was necessary for continuity within a specific tradition. Genesis uses genealogy to carry the story forward, not to describe the entire human world. The narrowing also affects how the earlier world is remembered. Figures associated with renown, violence, or magnitude do not factor into the new structure. They do not contribute to lineage. Without descendants named in the chosen line, they have no place in the ongoing narrative. Memory becomes selective by design. In this framework, survival is not the same as significance. Many lives may continue outside the narrative focus, but only one line carries the story. This distinction is structural, not moral. The text does not claim exclusivity of existence. It claims continuity of account. Archaeological and historical records from the ancient Near East show similar patterns. Royal genealogies trace legitimacy through specific lines, while ignoring parallel branches. Tribal records preserve ancestry relevant to land claims or cultic roles. Omission does not imply absence. It reflects purpose. The Genesis account remains consistent with this approach. As the story progresses, details increase only where the line is followed. When Abram travels, locations are named. When he speaks, dialogue is recorded. These narrative expansions occur only after the narrowing has been established. Detail follows selection. The narrowing also stabilizes time. Earlier chapters compress centuries into lists. As the line tightens, time slows. Individual lifespans matter less than actions. Events are placed closer together. The world becomes narratively accessible. The distant, generalized past gives way to a nearer, specific sequence. This transition reshapes how the pre-flood world functions within the text. It becomes a backdrop rather than a reference point. The narrative does not return to it for comparison. It does not mine it for lessons or warnings. The early world recedes as the chosen line advances. The calmness of this narrowing is notable. There is no sense of loss expressed for what is left behind. The text does not pause to acknowledge excluded lines. It proceeds as though focus itself is sufficient justification. The story's coherence depends on this restraint. Later interpretations sometimes read the narrowing as a response to earlier disorder. The text itself does not state this. It simply changes scale. The world goes from many to few, from collective condition to individual movement. The change is enacted through structure, not explanation. By the time Abram appears, the narrative has completed its narrowing. From earth to nations, from nations to a family to one person, the line is set. Everything that follows will be shaped by this selection. The earlier world remains present only as distant context. This narrowing does not erase the memory of earlier figures. It renders them inactive. They remain part of the background from which the line emerged. The story continues without returning to them, not because they are resolved, but because they are no longer required. The world of Genesis becomes legible through focus. What began as a broad description of conditions resolves into a single path of transmission. Continuity is secured by narrowing, not by domination. The account advances by choosing where to look. After images of a lost age. The early world described in Genesis does not return directly after the flood. It leaves no scenes, no artifacts, and no sustained commentary. What remains are traces. These traces appear later as brief references, borrowed language, and names that surface without explanation. They do not reconstruct what was lost. They signal that something older still lingers at the edges of memory. One of the most visible afterimages is linguistic. Rare terms such as Nephilim do not disappear entirely. They reappear in isolated contexts, separated by long stretches of narrative time. When the word surfaces in Numbers 13, it is not reintroduced or defined. The text assumes recognition. The name functions as a reference point rather than as a description. It carries weight precisely because it is unexplained. This pattern is common in ancient literature. Names associated with distant times often survive as markers of extremity. They are used to frame comparison rather than to preserve detail. In Numbers, the Nephilim name is invoked to express scale and fear, not to document continuity. The earlier world is not said to persist. It is recalled indirectly, through a word that still resonates. Other afterimages appear in poetic and prophetic language. Later biblical texts sometimes speak of ancient days, former times, or generations long past. These phrases rarely specify events. They create depth rather than content. The past is treated as a reservoir of meaning, not as a record to be reopened. The flood marks a boundary beyond which detail does not return. Second Temple literature expands on this distance. Texts such as 1 Enoch revisit themes associated with the early world, including watchers, giants, and disorder. These writings do not claim to restore lost history. They reinterpret fragments within new frameworks. Their interest lies in explanation rather than recovery. They reflect how later communities grappled with silence. The existence of these expansions highlights a contrast. Where Genesis remains restrained, later texts elaborate. Where Genesis records conditions without narrative, later authors supply stories. This difference underscores that the biblical account did not lose detail over time. It chose not to preserve it. The silence is original, not the result of erosion. In early Christian writings, references to ancient figures continue this indirect pattern. Authors such as Jude and 2 Peter allude to events associated with early transgression, often drawing on shared traditions without recounting them fully. These references function as reminders rather than as reconstructions. They assume familiarity without providing access. Outside biblical tradition, other cultures show similar handling of primordial ages. Greek writers referred to earlier ages of heroes or demigods whose world no longer existed. Hesiod's ages of gold and bronze are not described in practical terms. They are remembered through qualities rather than conditions. The earlier age is not recoverable. It is contrasted with the present. Mesopotamian texts preserve echoes as well. After the flood, kingship resumes, but early rulers with extraordinary reigns remain confined to lists. Their world is acknowledged and then set aside. Later kings do not attempt to emulate or restore it. The boundary holds. Archaeology reinforces this pattern of separation. Material records increase after certain thresholds and diminish before them. Early periods are represented sparsely, often through indirect indicators rather than through continuous documentation. This does not confirm the narratives, but it mirrors their structure. The afterimages of the early world also appear in how later texts speak about limits. Warnings against violence, corruption, and excess are framed without explicit reference to the pre-flood world, yet they echo its description. The earlier age functions as an implicit contrast. It informs boundaries without being revisited. In this way, the lost age remains present without being described. It influences tone rather than content. The narrative does not draw lessons openly. It does not return to explain what went wrong. It allows later structures to stand without reference to their opposite. Modern interpretations often attempt to reverse this restraint. They seek to reconstruct environments, societies, and hierarchies. These reconstructions draw from imagination, analogy, or speculative synthesis. The ancient texts themselves resist this process. They preserve fragments without context, and then move on. The persistence of names without narratives is one of the clearest signs of this resistance. A name that survives without story cannot be easily domesticated. It remains ambiguous. It invites reference but denies reconstruction. The Nephilim name functions in this way across traditions. The final effect is a layered memory. The early world is not erased, but it is not accessible. It survives as an outline, a boundary, and a vocabulary of excess and distance. Later texts gesture toward it without reopening it. The flood seals it off narratively, even as echoes continue. This structure allows the Genesis account to remain stable. It does not require correction or supplementation within the text itself. It leaves space for later interpretation without depending on it. The early world becomes a fixed absence, shaping what follows by what it no longer provides. The documentary record, as preserved, ends in this quiet way. The lost age does not return. It is not recovered. It is remembered indirectly, through words that still carry weight but no longer carry detail. The silence remains intact. What persists is continuity, lineage, and a narrowed human story. The earlier world remains behind that story, visible only through afterimages. The text allows those afterimages to exist without resolution. It closes the record where it began, with restraint rather than explanation. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to see more documentaries like this, subscribing helps keep the channel going. More videos will be added soon. Feel free to share your thoughts or suggestions below.